I inherited my grandfather's property in rural Pennsylvania almost by accident. My parents were both only children, and by the time Grandpa died, there was no one else to take it. He had lived on that land for decades, tending to a few acres of forest and meadow. The house itself was a mishmash of old architecture timber walls from a 19th century cabin, half-rotted floorboards, and a single stone fireplace so massive it felt like an ancient monument. Despite the place's obvious disrepair, something about it drew me in, compelled me to visit and see if maybe I could fix it up, or at least understand why Grandpa was always so fervent about never selling it. The day after I arrived, I found myself searching through the piles of dusty boxes scattered in the attic, rummaging for anything of value. Most contained old clothes, worn tools, or water-damaged letters, but then I opened a small chest, hidden in a dark corner behind a heap of rotted wood. Inside lay a family diary, one I didn't recognize. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, but the words on the first page were still legible in swirling black ink. Property of the Rosenfield family, 1844. I had no idea we had ancestors in this area dating back that far. My family never talked much about their past. Curiosity piqued. I settled onto an old wooden stool, coughing at the dust swirling in the attic light. I flipped through the pages. The diary chronicled a man named Thomas Rosenfield, who had settled the land well before it was officially deeded. He wrote about clearing trees, planting crops, and surviving brutally cold winters. But as I read on, the entries took a darker turn, describing a specific spot in the forest he referred to only as the mouth. At first, Thomas's mentions of this mouth were vague, just notes about a strange sinkhole or pit near a creek on the property. But deeper into the diary, I encountered unsettling details that put a chill in my bones. The entries described the pit as though it were alive, capable of speaking and whispering indecipherable words, especially at night. Thomas wrote with increasing obsession, claiming the mouth asked for offerings, first small animals, then larger. In exchange, it gave him knowledge. He never quite explained how it communicated, only that he could sense its voice from the depths of the earth. I skimmed faster, heart hammering, until I reached a passage near the end. My mind cannot rest. I found the mouth open wide at dusk. It whispered secrets, things no man should know. I offered the blood of a stag. I offered the blood of a goat. I feel its hunger growing. It demands more. Soon I'll have nothing to feed it. Yet I cannot leave. It knows me. And it told me how to avoid the plague that took my neighbors. It told me where to find silver in the hills. The bargains are too great to resist. I fear I am damned. Spine tingling, I carefully flipped to the final entry. The writing was frantic, letters barely decipherable. It's still hungry, and I'm running out of animals. It knows my thoughts. It knows where I sleep. I hear it whisper at my window each night. God have mercy. I cannot keep it waiting any longer. I will do what must be done. Thomas's journal ended abruptly after that. No mention of what he ultimately sacrificed. No closure. Just those desperate words. I'm running out of animals. I stared at the date. 1846. The rest of the pages were torn out, leaving only scraps of paper, as if he'd intended to keep writing but never had the chance. A dreadful unease settled over me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation. Yet the specificity of his claims, the hunger, the whispers, the secrets, got under my skin. I closed the diary, inhaling the stale attic air. I noticed the quiet hush of midday around me, as if even the dusty rafters were holding their breath. That evening, after the sun dipped low behind the pines, I found myself unable to shake the diary's hold on my thoughts. The forest outside seemed to beckon, as if the words in that old diary had awakened something that now waited among the trees. A flicker of fear gnawed at me, but also a spark of curiosity. I took a lantern and ventured behind the old farmhouse, across a weed-choked field and into the line of tall oaks and maples that marked the forest's edge. The night chorus of insects and frogs enveloped me. Occasionally, a breeze rustled the branches, and I'd jump at shadows cast by the lantern's flicker. Still, I pushed forward, searching for any sign of a pit or sinkhole. About a quarter-mile in, I caught the scent of damp earth mixed with a faint metallic tang. The wind had died, and the insects quieted, as though some great predator had come into the clearing. My lantern revealed a sloping ground that dipped into a circular depression, ringed by gnarled tree roots. The trees here grew in twisted shapes, their branches reaching out like arthritic fingers, and at the center lay a pit, a dark opening about 6 feet across. I peered over the edge. The lantern's feeble glow barely reached the bottom, but I saw rocky walls descending into blackness. A sudden wave of revulsion rolled through me, and I stumbled backward. There was something deeply wrong about that opening. My pulse quickened, and I recalled the diary's words. The mouth. Could it truly be alive? My rational mind rebelled at the idea, but I couldn't ignore the intangible sense of malevolence wafting up from that hole, as though it exhaled stale, centuries-old breath. I heard nothing but my own heartbeat. No whispers, no voices. Still, I sensed that I was not alone. The intangible feeling of being watched pressed upon me, urging me to leave. I obeyed, backing away slowly until the circle of twisted trees was behind me. Then, keeping my lantern raised, I hurried home under the gaze of a silent moon. Sleep proved elusive that night. Every time I drifted off, I imagined a faint voice whispering from beneath the ground. Hungry, hungry. I'd bolt awake, covered in sweat, the old diary resting on the nightstand next to me. By dawn, I gave up on rest altogether and returned to the attic, determined to find more clues about this so-called mouth. I rifled through crates and boxes, scanning for anything referencing Thomas Rosenfield or his immediate descendants. Eventually, I found a brittle packet of letters. Most were to or from neighbors in the mid-1800s, and they contained mentions of blighted crops, missing livestock, and, occasionally, unexplainable vanishings of pets or wandering travelers. While none explicitly named the mouth, I saw repeated references to the cursed land near the creek and some unnatural sinkhole. A few warnings were scrawled in shaky handwriting. Do not linger near that spot at night, or stay away from the blood-stained pit. It was as though everyone in the area knew something was wrong with that particular patch of forest. My great-great-great-grandfather, and whomever else followed him, must have guarded this secret for generations. I shuddered, imagining what deals they might have struck, what bargains the diary hinted at. At the bottom of the packet lay one final note, unsigned and undated, yet written in more modern penmanship. It simply read, "It never stops. It never sleeps. God help whoever tries to feed it." A pit formed in my stomach. Whether it was real or not, the legend alone was enough to plague a family. Had Grandpa known? Had he refused to speak of it, hoping the knowledge would die with him? I tried to go about my normal routine the next few days, cooking, cleaning, surveying the property, and making a list of repairs, but my mind drifted constantly back to that hole in the forest. Each time I stood at the kitchen window and gazed out, I swore the pines in the distance looked darker, more foreboding. I felt an odd compulsion to return, even as my instincts screamed in warning. Finally, one afternoon I decided to do a more thorough inspection in daylight. I strapped on hiking boots, grabbed a flashlight and rope, and made my way once more to the clearing. Beneath the sun, the area looked less menacing, but no less eerie. The trees were indeed warped, as if they had grown around something toxic in the soil. The pit's opening gaped silently, a mouth waiting to swallow light and sound alike. Standing there, I realized no animals were visible in this part of the woods. No birds, no squirrels, no insects buzzing around. The quiet was absolute, unnatural. I approached the pit slowly, peering in with my flashlight. The walls descended about 10 to 15 feet, then curved away, making it impossible to see the bottom. A wave of dizziness washed over me, as though the pit exerted a strange gravity. I felt a tingling in my fingertips. My breath quickened. A part of me wanted to throw rocks in, to see how deep it went. Another part wanted to turn and run, vowing never to return. But I was rooted there, transfixed by the darkness. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. My heart nearly stopped. It didn't sound like wind or an echo, but an actual voice, hushed, sighing from deep within the earth. I couldn't make out words, only a breathy resonance. A cold sweat broke across my forehead. For a moment I considered leaning closer, but terror overrode curiosity. I scrambled backward, nearly tripping on tangled roots, then fled the clearing. For hours afterward, I could still feel that whisper reverberating in my ears, a sibilant hush that seemed to say, blood, feed me, or something equally grotesque. Whenever I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, the memory of that voice argued otherwise. That evening, in the safety of Grandpa's old living room, I steeled myself and returned to the diary, determined to glean how Thomas had initially interacted with the mouth. The first mention of offerings was tentative, like he'd stumbled upon the solution by accident. He'd cut his hand near the pit and noticed the whispers intensify. Over time, he discovered that leaving small amounts of animal blood made the voice grow clearer, revealing secrets, useful information about crops, weather, hidden resources. The cost, however, escalated. Thomas wrote about guilt gnawing at him. I have fed it rabbits, chickens, a stray dog. Each time, the mouth rewards me with knowledge. I am ashamed, but the benefits are undeniable. Soon, rabbits and dogs were insufficient. He started talking about sheep, goats, a horse. As the animals grew larger, so did the monstrous demands, and presumably, the secrets bestowed became more valuable or more intimate. Then came references to the pit's intangible power. Thomas believed it could invade his dreams, urging him to continue feeding it. He tried stopping once, but claims he awoke one night to find himself walking to the pit in a trance, carrying a slaughtered lamb he didn't remember killing. Its voice is inside my skull. I cannot escape. I do not wish to, for it has promised me salvation. I shivered. The entire dynamic reminded me of a fable about a demon's bargain temporary gain in exchange for horrifying debt. I realized with mounting horror what the final lines meant. I'm running out of animals. Thomas likely resorted to an even darker offering. Nothing overtly strange happened for 2 days after my second trip to the clearing. I tried my best to ignore the sense of foreboding that clung to me. Then, on a damp morning, I woke to a metallic smell coming from outside. Alarmed, I opened the back door to find a small smear of blood on the doorstep. My heart jumped. Had a wounded animal crawled here? Or was it something else? Following the thin trail of droplets across the backyard and into the forest, I felt my stomach twist. The pattern of the blood was not random. It formed a continuous line, as if carefully dripped or dragged. My mind raced with the possibilities. Maybe a deer had been shot by a hunter and stumbled onto my property, but the trail went straight toward the clearing. There was no sign of any struggle or footprints, only the steady line of crimson. By the time I reached the twisted trees, my pulse hammered in my ears. The ground near the pit was disturbingly clean, but I noticed fresh spatters of blood staining the roots that encircled it. A sickening realization slammed into me. Something or someone had offered a sacrifice to that hole last night. And the trail of blood leading back to my house wasn't an accident. It was a message or a marker. I pictured that mouth in the earth devouring flesh and blood. A surge of nausea gripped me. My rational side insisted this had to be the work of a disturbed person playing a macabre prank. But my fear spoke a different truth, that the pit had awakened again, hungry after a long dormancy, and it somehow knew me, just as it had known Thomas. After making the grim discovery, I rushed back home, locked the doors, and spent the rest of the day pacing. The shadows of the old farmhouse felt claustrophobic, the musty smell tinged with something mouldy, like grave dirt. I called the local sheriff about a possible wounded animal near my property. He said he'd send someone to check, but I could tell he considered it low priority. That night, I dreamt of the pit. In my sleep, I stood at its edge under a blood-red moon, gripping a struggling goat that bleated in terror. My hands moved of their own accord, slicing its throat. Dark blood streamed into the pit, and from the darkness rose a deep voice, half whisper, half growl, promising me answers to every question I'd ever had. I felt a twisted mixture of horror and fascination, as though the act of violence was simultaneously repulsive and liberating. The voice caressed my ears, whispering promises of success, wealth, health, secrets about my neighbors, predictions of the future. I awoke drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled, my heart hammering in my chest. I felt soiled by the dream, as if I'd truly committed the act. The echo of that voice lingered in my mind, beckoning me back to the pit. I tried to calm myself, remind myself it was only a nightmare. But the memory of it was so vivid an experience that seemed more real than waking life. Morning brought no solace. The day was grey, drizzle pattering on the roof. The sheriff's deputy arrived around noon, walked around the yard, found little but a faint blood residue that the rain had mostly washed away. He chalked it up to an injured deer. No body, no footprints, no reason for alarm. He left a business card and told me to call if I saw anything else. Frustration welled inside me, but I managed to thank him politely. Nobody else could understand the existential dread that Diary had awakened. And I wasn't exactly eager to say, "Hey, by the way, there's a cursed mouth in the woods demanding blood sacrifices." After the deputy left, I stood in the kitchen staring out at the forest. A dull ache throbbed behind my eyes. The diaries, the letters, the bizarre events. It felt like a net tightening around me, ensuring I couldn't just walk away. The property was mine, the legacy was mine, and the mouth evidently knew that. I could leave, sure, but would it follow me? Would the nightmares stop? I wasn't sure. A strangled laugh escaped my lips, half hysteria, half disbelief. I had never been one for superstition, yet here I stood, contemplating how to escape a family curse. My reflection in the window looked tired, haunted. I almost didn't recognize myself. The next night, the whispering began in earnest. I was in the living room reading, trying to distract myself, when a sudden hush fell outside. No crickets, no wind. The air grew heavy, thick enough to taste. Then, just at the edge of hearing, a voice seeped in, a distorted murmur coming from nowhere and everywhere. I froze, ears straining. It was as if the walls exhaled a faint come feed. My skin prickled and my heart began to race. I glanced around, sure someone else was in the house. But I was alone. The voice swelled, forming incomprehensible words that seemed to echo in the corners of the room. I spun toward the window and thought, for an instant I saw a silhouette of a man among the trees, standing utterly still. Then the shadows shifted and he vanished. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I shut the book and pressed my hands over my ears. It didn't help. The voice resonated inside my skull. My stomach churned with a wave of dizziness. I clenched my teeth, stumbling into the hallway. Something within me yearned to go outside, to follow the voice to its source. My veins felt hot, as though something ancient and primal had awakened within me, urging me to answer the call. Gasping for breath, I forced myself into the bedroom, turned on every light, and blasted the radio. Slowly, the voice receded, leaving me trembling, drenched in cold sweat. I knew, without a doubt, the pit had begun to call me. Having no one else to turn to, I opened my laptop and scoured the internet for any references to local legends about a buried mouth or a talking pit. Results were predictably scarce, just a scattering of cryptid forums and mythological references to hungry earth spirits. Nothing definitive. At last, with a mix of dread and determination, I revisited that final portion of Thomas Rosenfield's diary. He spoke of wrestling with his conscience, trying to fight the compulsion that the mouth instilled in him. He wrote, "I can leave for a time, but it calls me back. It gave me too much, showed me secrets I dare not repeat. I am bound to it now, for it threatens to speak those secrets to others if I do not continue. All the while, it hungers and hungers. Soon my flock is gone. I have no choice but to consider the unthinkable." The references to the unthinkable repeated over multiple entries, culminating in the final line. "It's still hungry, and I'm running out of animals." Then the diary ended. My imagination filled the blanks. Did he feed it a person? A family member? A stranger? The idea sent shivers down my spine. Perhaps that was how the cycle continued, how the mouth remained dormant until new bloodlines arrived. The notion filled me with revulsion and a strange underlying fascination. Because if the mouth truly gave knowledge, I wondered, what might it offer me? That question alone terrified me. It was the same trap Thomas had fallen into, the promise of power, of hidden truths. I wanted no part of it, but the voice gnawed at the edges of my mind, reminding me that I had already heard its call, dreamt its promises. My soul quivered at the thought of a path from which there might be no return. Over the following days, more blood trails appeared, thin, deliberate lines that led from the forest edge to somewhere near the house. It was as though invisible hands were coaxing me, leaving a breadcrumb trail of gore to ensure I knew the pit remained active. I never discovered an actual animal carcass, nor any sign of footprints. It was as if the blood manifested on its own, I started to dread twilight, when the hush fell over the woods, and that whispering resumed. Sometimes it would start as a barely perceptible hum, scratching at the back of my skull. Other times it was a sudden, violent murmur that made the windows rattle. My nights were spent in paranoid vigilance, shotgun by my bed, lights blazing, radio on. Yet none of it truly kept the voice at bay. It found me no matter how I tried to hide. Between these episodes, I found myself drawn to the old diaries and letters again, poring over every clue, hoping to discover a method of banishing this evil. But there was no mention of exorcism or redemption. My ancestor wrote only of appeasement and endless caution. I began to suspect the reason Grandpa had never talked about it was that he'd never confronted it. Perhaps he ignored it, refused to feed it, and in turn it stayed dormant until now. But something had changed. Maybe my arrival stirred it from sleep, or maybe the centuries of quiet simply left it ravenous. Either way, I sensed it wouldn't be satisfied with small offerings for long. At last, desperation trumped fear. One late afternoon, I decided to climb down into the pit to see if there was any physical sign of what might be causing these phenomena. Part of me believed that if I could find an underground chamber, maybe an old well or cave system, I could rationalize it all away. So, armed with rope, a powerful flashlight, and a crowbar, I returned to the clearing. The twisted trees loomed in grim silence as I approached. The pit gaped at me, dark and damp. Tremors of unease rippled through my limbs, but I forced myself forward, tying the rope around a sturdy trunk and fastening the other end to my waist. Slowly, I lowered myself over the edge. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The walls were slick with algae and loose stones. After about 15 feet, the shaft widened, and I found a narrow ledge to stand on. The smell of wet earth mingled with a pungent odor, reminiscent of decaying leaves and something coppery. I flicked the flashlight around, revealing a cramped tunnel extending sideways, a ragged passage large enough to crawl through. Steeling myself, I inched inside, shoulders scraping damp rock. My flashlight's beam illuminated scattered bonesbird skeletons, maybe a deer. My breath caught when I saw something suspiciously human-shaped. It was too decayed to be sure. A chill of horror crawled through my veins. This is insane, I thought, wanting to turn back immediately. But I kept inching forward, compelled by a fearful curiosity. Deeper in, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The ground was sticky underfoot. It reeked of rancid blood and rot. My flashlight quivered in my hand, illuminating lumps of fur, old clothing, dried gore. I nearly gagged, and then from the far end of that chamber came a whisper, a direct, guttural hiss of words. The flashlight flickered as though responding to an electrical current. My body seized in terror. I couldn't pass the exact phrase, but the final word was unmistakable. Hungry. A primal panic burst inside me. I dropped the crowbar and scrambled back the way I came, skin scraping on rocks. The whisper reverberated through the tunnel, growing louder, forming half words that might have been, "Feed me, feed me, feed me." My rope snagged twice, my lungs burned. I felt an invisible presence brushing against me in the darkness, tasting my fear. By the time I hauled myself out of the pit, I was shaking uncontrollably. The sunlight felt foreign, the air too thin. I collapsed on the grass, retching. The forest was eerily quiet, as though mocking my terror. I knew then that there was no logical explanation. That thing in the earth was indeed some malignant force, very much awake and aware of me. Days passed in a haze. The whispering grew more demanding each night. My attempts at calling in local authorities to investigate the pit were met with indifference or confusion. Without hard evidence, there was nothing they could do. After all, who would believe me if I claimed the ground itself was hungry? The stress wore on me. I slept maybe an hour or two each night, plagued by nightmares in which I slaughtered animals, or, worse, humans. I'd wake up screaming, convinced the blood was on my hands. The line between dream and reality blurred dangerously. One afternoon I stood outside in the yard, staring at the woodline, hearing the faint voice in broad daylight now, urging me to come closer. I felt a strange impulse to offer something to the pit, just to make it stop, maybe a fish from the local creek, or a chicken from a neighbor's farm. But that was the path to madness. The moment I gave in, I'd be no different from Thomas. The voice wanted me to feed it so it could give me secrets, knowledge, hold me in its power. Perhaps the entire lineage was cursed to battle that temptation. I gripped my hair in frustration, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. "No!" I shouted into the silent trees. "You won't have me." A wave of dizziness struck, as if the pit had laughed at my defiance. Eventually, the final straw arrived. It was early morning when I stepped outside to fetch firewood. My eyes locked onto a fresh, thick trail of blood curving from the edge of the forest straight to my back door. This time, it wasn't just droplets. It was a glistening, continuous swath of red, as though something had been dragged. My gut twisted in revulsion. I followed the trail only a few steps before I spotted something lying in the grass. A piece of raw, bloody meat, torn and ragged. It might have been part of a deer's flank. My hand flew to my mouth, bile rising in my throat. The trail led further into the woods, presumably back to that cursed pit. The message was unambiguous. The mouth was bringing its kill to me now, demanding I complete the offering. My head spun with horror and rage. I ran inside, slamming and bolting the door behind me. Enough. This had to end. The pit would never stop unless I did something drastic. Thomas's diary provided no solution, but perhaps there was a way to bury it literally. If the pit fed off blood seeping through the earth, maybe I could entomb it, seal the entire opening with stone and cement. I had no guarantee that would work, but it was my only plan. Trembling, I resolved to try. Driven by desperation, I used Grandpa's old truck to haul concrete mix, stones, and heavy boards out to the clearing. The day was cold and overcast, the sky a dull slate grey. A hollow fear gripped my stomach, but I forced myself to keep moving, mixing cement in a wheelbarrow, unloading slabs of rock. If the pit was truly supernatural, maybe such a mundane approach would fail, but maybe it wouldn't. Maybe the mouth was only as strong as the fear it inspired. I spread the boards across the opening and started layering stones, pouring cement between them to create a makeshift plug. The forest remained deathly still, as though holding its breath. With each rock I placed, I half expected the ground to quake or the boards to snap from some invisible force. But nothing happened, just the quiet rustle of leaves and my own panicked breathing. Eventually, I erected a rough stone platform over the mouth, packing it with more concrete and dirt. The final result was crude, but it blocked the pit entirely. Exhausted, I staggered back, caked in mud and sweat, uncertain if I'd accomplished anything. But at least the vile opening was no longer visible. "If you can't breathe, you can't whisper," I muttered under my breath, half laughing with delirium. I lingered a moment, expecting some sign that it had worked. The wind picked up, rustling the twisted trees. For an instant, I thought I heard a muffled moan from beneath the stones, but it faded swiftly, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat. Feeling a faint glimmer of hope, I turned and walked away. That night, I slept deeper than I had in weeks. No whispers invaded my dreams, no horrifying images of feeding blood to the earth. When I awoke at dawn, the silence in my head felt blissful. The day passed normally enough. I drove into town for supplies, did some house repairs, even managed to watch TV without glancing nervously at the windows. 2 days later, the blood trails vanished. The nightmares subsided. It was as though a malignant energy had been cut off. My appetite returned. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to relax. Perhaps I'd done it. Perhaps sealing the pit starved it out, forced it to slumber. I recalled how certain folklore suggests that curses can be halted if the source is physically contained. Maybe the old diaries never mentioned it because Thomas never tried. By day 4 of peace, I was almost jubilant. I even looked up local contractors to discuss properly filling the area with cement. I told them I was dealing with an old well that posed a hazard. The practicality of a normal life settled in again. On the 5th night after sealing the pit, however, I was jolted awake by a thunderous crack. It reverberated through the house, shaking the windows. Adrenaline surged. At first, I thought a tree had fallen on the roof. Bolting upright, I rushed outside with a flashlight. The sound echoed again, a deep, grinding rumble from the forest. With dread coiling in my stomach, I realized it came from the direction of the clearing. My heart thudded in my chest as I sprinted across the yard. A smell of sulfur tainted the air. Reaching the clearing, I shone my flashlight on the makeshift stone seal I'd constructed. A massive fissure now split the platform. Steam or mist seeped from the crack, curling into the night. I stared in horror as the broken sections of cement shifted, as if something beneath them pushed upward. Suddenly, a chunk of stone exploded outward with a bang, and I threw myself to the ground. The flashlight spun from my hand. Amid the debris and swirling dust, I heard a guttural roar like a furious wounded animal. Then, to my shock, I realized the roar held words. Hungry, still hungry. Cold terror flooded my veins. I fumbled for the flashlight, breathing in ragged gasps. The stone seal was coming apart, shattered from below. Beneath it, a deep blackness flickered as if alive. I felt a force tugging at me, an invisible suction. The mouth was open again, and furious. I scrambled away on all fours. My mind screamed at me to flee. But even as I retreated, I heard that monstrous voice, now a hellish choir of whispers and roars, echoing through the twisted trees. No escape. Feed me. Feed me. I screamed in sheer panic, stumbling back through the forest until I found my truck. Tires spinning on muddy ground, I floored it, heading for the safety of the house. My plan to seal the pit had failed, perhaps even worsened the situation by enraging it. Back home, I locked the doors and windows, turned every light on, grabbed my shotgun and paced in terror. The voice resounded in my mind, unrelenting. You tried to silence me, but I will have your blood. The words pounded through my skull with a feverish intensity. I braced myself for the unthinkable. Perhaps the pit would extend its corruption out of the ground entirely. A frantic thought emerged. Maybe the pit required a final living sacrifice to quell it once and for all. But the idea revolted me. I couldn't commit murder. Another possibility flared, self-sacrifice. The notion took root in my hysterical mind. Thomas had talked about lacking animals. In his final entry, maybe he offered himself. Perhaps that was why the diary ended. Could that be the only way the mouth ever truly slept? Tears streamed down my face. My hands shook so badly I could scarcely hold the shotgun. The whispers crescendoed, filling my head with seductive promises and horrifying threats. Bring me flesh, or come yourself. I refused to feed it another living creature. I'd been pushed beyond fear into a kind of mad resolve. Fine, then. If that was the only solution, I would put an end to this torment on my own terms. Let the curse die with me, before it could claim anyone else. Pale and shaking, I grabbed a gas can, stepping into the blackness of the yard. The forest loomed, and the voice in my head amplified, as if sensing my intention. I forced myself forward, ignoring the cold wind that lashed my face. The blood trails on the ground seemed to glow under the moonlight, beckoning me onward. At the clearing, I saw the pit wide open, a ragged gap in the earth. The stones I'd laid were strewn around, the wooden boards splintered. The stench of decay and sulphur choked the air. From the darkness of that gaping hole came a wet, slithering exhale, an anticipation of a meal. With trembling resolve, I began pouring gasoline around the perimeter of the clearing, on the twisted trees, on the edge of the pit. The voice hissed in my mind, desperate or enraged, it was hard to tell. I kept my distance, splashing the last drops on the soil. Then I lit a match. Instantly, fire whooshed to life, racing around the circle. The flames rose high, devouring branches and creeping toward the pit's edge. Thick smoke billowed upward. The mouth roared, an unholy sound that rattled my teeth. I drew closer, the heat scorching my skin, and pointed the shotgun at the opening, my tears evaporating in the flames. "You will have nothing," I screamed. "No more blood." In a final crazed act, I tossed the shotgun aside and stepped closer to the pit, letting the flames lick at my clothes. The ground quaked beneath my feet as the mouth bellowed from its depths. Time seemed to slow. I prepared to leap into the flames in the hole beyond, hoping my sacrifice and the inferno would seal this evil forever. Suddenly, a massive gout of flame erupted, knocking me backward. I landed hard on the ground, nearly unconscious. My vision blurred with swirling sparks. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the clearing consumed by hellish fire, the twisted trees burning like torches, and the pit's orifice enveloped in a torrent of glowing embers. I woke in daylight. Smoke hung in the air and ashes blanketed the earth. My head throbbed. Coughing, I struggled to my feet. The clearing was charred and blackened, every tree reduced to smouldering stumps. The place where the pit had been was now a collapsed hole filled with debris, still emitting wisps of smoke. No sign of any conscious presence. No whispering. No voice in my head. I cautiously approached. The ground was hot under my boots. The edges of the pit had caved in, forming a mound of ash and burned stone. It looked like the entire structure had collapsed inward, sealing itself in a tomb of rubble and dirt. An eerie silence reigned, broken only by crackling embers. Somehow I was alive, though singed and bruised. My ears still rang from that final roar. With shaky relief, I realized the voice was gone. Whether by the fire or the partial collapse, the mouth had been silenced, or so I hoped. I stared at the destruction, sobered by the horrifying struggle I'd just endured. I left the property soon after, unwilling to remain on land so deeply marred by ancient malevolence. I sold it at a pittance to a local conservation group, explaining that the area was badly burned and not fit for agriculture or habitation. Part of me feels guilty not disclosing why it was truly cursed, but I couldn't bear to speak of it. Even now, I have nightmares about that voice calling me, about blood seeping through the floorboards to feed a ravenous mouth in the earth. Occasionally I check the online records to see if anyone ever attempted to rebuild. So far, no one has. The forest regrows slowly, year by year. I wonder if the mouth sleeps beneath that rubble, biding its time. On stormy nights, I sometimes jolt awake, half certain I hear it whisper through the wind. Still hungry, and that is my story, my family's dark inheritance. A pit in the earth that devours blood and offers secrets. My ancestor's final diary entry, "It's still hungry and I'm running out of animals," haunts me. I almost joined him in that final sacrifice. I can only hope my actions buried the mouth for good. Yet some nights, in the darkness behind my closed eyelids, I see the flicker of a new blood trail, leading from a lonely forest straight to my door.